Well, I hope you're enjoying our walk through the history of Israel as we prepare to transition from studying the Torah to studying what is known as the books of the former prophets. Now, the former prophets begin with the books Joshua and then Judges. Now, last week we looked at one of the most profound, truly earth-shaking, and little-known prophecies in the Bible, the cross-handed blessing of Jacob, that he bestowed upon his grandchildren, Ephraim and Manasseh. Now, these two grandchildren were the Egyptian sons of Joseph. They were Egyptian because their mother, Joseph's wife, was an Egyptian. And as part of this cross-handed blessing, Jacob also adopted Ephraim and Manasseh away from Joseph and made them as his own sons. Thus, he was legally able to give to Ephraim the rights of the firstborn, although he was the younger of two grandchildren. All of that should have belonged to Jacob's true physical firstborn son, Reuben. We also reviewed that 2 of the 12 tribes of Israel eventually became dominant over all of the other ones, Judah and Ephraim. And after the death of the second king of a united Israel, which was Solomon, the nation disintegrated into civil war and chaos, and it became split into 2 separately governed kingdoms, that of Ephraim, typically called Israel in our Bibles, and of Judah. Now, Ephraim had become a conglomerate of 10 of the 12 tribes, with Judah consisting of the remaining 2. Ephraim had a larger desire to be like their pagan neighbors than to emulate and to obey God. And so the Lord led Assyria to conquer the kingdom of Ephraim and scatter those 10 tribes that they represented all over the Asian and to a lesser degree African continents. Thus was born the legend of the 10 lost tribes of Israel. Now, Ezekiel tells us of a time in the near future when Judah and Ephraim will both come back from their exiles and be present in the promised land. Now, I told you that this exact thing is in process right now as I speak, although it will go through some serious hiccups and it's not yet completed. So let's resume our study today with Israel's time in Egypt. Let's return to our discussion of the time of Joseph. It's a little after 1800 BC. And the 12 tribes of Israel, now in Egypt, are going to remain there for the next 4 centuries. At first as guests, then citizens, and finally as slaves. Now, much has been written about the time that Israel, the Hebrews, spent in Egypt, a large part of it expressing skepticism that they were ever even there. Now, interestingly, the problem is not that a large center of ancient Hebrew culture hasn't been found in Egypt. It has. The problem is with the timing and the dating. According to archaeologists, the Hebrew culture found in Egypt doesn't match with the biblical timeline of when Israel was supposed to have been in Egypt. Therefore, many scholars say the Bible story of Israel's captivity and then their exodus is just a folk tale. Now, the issue of whether or not Israel was actually ever in Egypt is really no longer in doubt. Egyptologists have indeed found the remains of an enormous Hebrew community in Egypt in the land of Goshen, which is a region of Egypt, right where the Bible says they were. This community was estimated to have been able to accommodate at least 2 million people. It is called in scientific circles by its archaeological name, Tel Ed-Dabah. And by its most recent historic name, it's called Avaris. It's located right next to P-Ramesses, the great city of the Pharaoh. It all matches up perfectly with the biblical account except for one thing. Because of the currently accepted dating system, using what scientists call regnal dating, that's dating based on the incredibly incomplete, often baseless line of Egyptian royalty, archaeologists say, okay, the city's there, but it's in the wrong time. So understand, you should listen with a lot of skepticism to A&E and the History Channel and Discovery and others that most often attempt to refute the biblical accounts. Archaeologists have indeed found many biblical cities, but because scientists want to stick to the outdated and largely discredited regnal dating system, they refuse to acknowledge these biblical archaeological finds, not because they're not there, not because they stood on them, they've excavated them, but because they supposedly occur in the wrong time. Well, back to our account of Israel and Egypt. The Bible is silent. From the time of the death of Joseph, who died at the age of 110, till the birth of MOSHEH, Moses, which is a period of about 300 years. Extra biblical sources indicate that for the first 150 to 200 years after the Hebrews' arrival in Egypt, the Israelites prospered, their numbers exploded. The succession of Semite, not Egyptian pharaohs, well, they were tolerant of the Israelites. Excuse me, likely due to their realization of these family attachments of their distant relatives. They also remember, they continue to honor the promises made by Pharaoh to Joseph and Joseph's decrees granting Israel citizenship and land, and Joseph's historical position as a kind of savior of Egypt, saving them from famine. But Egypt is now in turmoil. Joseph died about 1700 BC, and memories and promises can be short-lived things. Egypt at this time was two nations, Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. And in addition, warlords, tribal chieftains, governed a few areas within the boundaries of the formerly united nation. Now, it's helpful for us to know that the names Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt are exactly reversed according to what our current traditions of indicating direction are. Upper Egypt is to the south. Lower Egypt is to the north. Now, after years of failed attempts by dozens of factions that were seeking power, an army led by an Egyptian general from Thebes, which is modern-day Luxor, finally overthrows the detested foreign pharaoh over Egypt. It's about 1600 BC. A new pharaoh, this time an Egyptian, he feels no obligation to Joseph's 200-year-old decree regarding his family, regarding the Israelites. The driving need is to reunite this fractured Egyptian society and to reestablish a strong central government. And to accomplish this, a common cause is needed. Changes are made. Overnight, a large Israelite population that's residing in Egypt is made the scapegoat for this nation's problems. And they are suddenly regarded as a threat to the nation. This scenario, with the Israelites, later called Jews, being blamed for a nation's problems and persecuted for it, is going to repeat itself time and again in the future. Well, within a few years, private ownership of property, which helped the Israelites achieve prosperity in Egypt in years past, this was outlawed for them. The new pharaoh, an Egyptian, decreed that the temples to the gods would now own 20% of the land, with the remainder belonging to the pharaoh himself. Peasants had no choice but to work the land as little more than serfs, and most Israelites had been reduced to peasants. Well, now Egypt, propelled by a horrific memory of foreign control and shameful subjugation, protected their borders at all costs. But they also directed their hate and their insecurity inward to the foreigners. Think what we're talking about. People who had lived there 200 or 300 years are now suddenly foreigners. Egypt rebuilt her armies, meant not only to defend, but to conquer with Egyptian people. The Israelites formed the foundation of the servant working class for Egypt's ambitious building projects. Egypt's loyal nationalist army, together with the forced labor of the Israelites, allowed Egypt to return to glory once again to become a player on the world stage. The Israelites, though, paid a very high price for their master's imperialistic design. Their lives were miserable, without hope. Anti-Semitism was at a fever pitch in Israel. Even with the impossible conditions that the Israelites suffered under, their numbers continued to increase, and this alarmed the populace, and it alarmed the Pharaoh. The Pharaoh, in an ancient method of birth control, ordered all male Israelite children killed immediately upon birth to stem the tide. Well, now it's about 1400 BC, and a baby is born to the Levite family of Amram and Jehoshaphat. Okay, the Levites are one of the 12 tribes of Israel. And they hide the child, and they know that the Egyptian guards are soon going to discover their secret, so they embark on a very desperate plan. They put the baby's fate entirely into God's hands. An Egyptian princess finds this Levite baby floating in a waterproof basket in the Nile, and she rescues this child from sure death, probably at the mouth of a hungry Nile crocodile. The princess makes him her own, names him MOSHEH. We call him Moses. See, MOSHEH is an Egyptian, not a Hebrew name. It means born of. Moshe, his Hebrew name, means to draw out. That is, he was drawn out of the water of the Nile. Well, Moses was raised in the palace of the Pharaoh, receiving nothing but the best. He learned math and writing. He was taught fighting skills, accounting, court etiquette. He would have been given authority over others, put his skills to use by his 13th birthday. Now, most common people of his time had an average lifespan of about 25 years. So maturing and assumption of useful duties occurred pretty early by our standards. Yet all evidence is that the Israelites, for some reason, had considerably longer lifespans. Despite some Hollywood versions to the contrary, Moses was always aware of who he was, likely visited his birth mother very often. She even suckled him for many months after he was plucked from the Nile, because his sister Miriam suggested as much to the princess. Well, one day when Moses was grown, he saw an Egyptian soldier strike an Israelite slave. Moses killed the guard. He buried him in the desert sand. I mean, why would he have done that? I mean, notice that the soldier did not kill the slave or even maim him. He just struck him. Surely an Egyptian soldier striking an Israelite slave was a common, everyday occurrence that he'd witnessed hundreds of times. Now, Egyptian law called for capital punishment for the killing of an Egyptian, no matter who the perpetrator. Moses knew this. At the very least, Moses willingly threw away the royal life he could have chosen. Could it have been that Moshe was guilt-ridden? He was angry at being considered a half-breed by Israelite and Egyptian alike, unwelcome in either camp. And he simply couldn't tolerate watching his own people whipped like animals while he lived a life of luxury. In any case, Moses found out, much to his surprise, that there were witnesses to this murderous act. So he fled the country. Problem is, he couldn't go to Canaan, where the roads and cities were guarded by Egyptian troops who might recognize him. There would have been a warrant out for his arrest. Instead, he went to a place of very little interest to any conquering nation, where only the hardiest souls attempted to survive, the Sinai. So after trekking across the Sinai, he crossed over to the other side of a finger of the Red Sea that's now called the Gulf of Aqaba, and he went into the land of Midian, which was the home to Bedouin desert wanderers. And after an incident at a water well, where Moses protected some local girls from being bullied, a Midianite priest takes him in and he gives him his eldest daughter for a wife. Moshe becomes a shepherd of flocks in a very barren, primitive land. He spends the next several years contemplating this impulsive act of murder that brought him here, fighting loneliness, trying to forget that privileged life he once lived in the Pharaoh's palace, and just kind of learning to adapt to his new home, seeking answers to why things are as they are. If all the gods of Egypt are false, as his father-in-law Jethro says, then who is God? Such things can humble a man, make a man very moldable. Well, about 40 years pass. Moses is now 80 years old, and he sees a flickering light off in the distance. This is a very uncommon occurrence out in the desert wilderness. And he goes to investigate, and on a tall hill that the Bible alternately refers to as the mountain of God and Mount Horeb, later on as Mount Sinai, Moses finds a bush that shines as though it's engulfed in flame, but it doesn't burn up. And as he approaches it for a closer examination, this thundering voice from above just forces him down to his knees. And as he approaches it for a closer examination, God reveals himself. And he tells him, I'm sending you to the Pharaoh and you're going to free my people. This is not what Moses had in mind. Not at all. And he tells God that. God, in his mercy, makes him some promises. It's going to be okay, Moses. Don't worry about it. I'm going to take care of everything. Moses responds with skepticism. God produces proofs. Moses asks to please be excused from the task. He offers some lame excuse about having a speech impediment. God gets angry. Moses accepts. Well, Moses informs his family now about his supernatural experience. And he takes his wife, he takes his children, he strikes out for Egypt. Now, I suspect somewhere along the line, he decides that what lies ahead is just too risky for his family. And so he sends them back. Because sometime later, while leading the freed Israelite nation out through the wilderness, the book of Exodus tells us of a reunion between Moses and his family. Now, Moses' older brother, Aaron, who will soon become the first high priest of Israel, greets Moses upon his arrival in Egypt. And Aaron has also been visited by God and informed of God's plan. So Aaron convinced the tribal elders in advance of Moses' arrival that Moses has been sent from God to free them. Moses and Aaron take God's message to free his people to the Pharaoh, who promptly rewards their effort by increasing the Israelites' already deadly workload. The tribal elders and the people are not thrilled by this turn of events, and they blame Moses. Moses confronts God about it. So it's at this point that God says some things that might be easily overlooked. And the often told story of Moshe and the Pharaoh. But what he says is truly momentous. In paraphrase, God says this. He says, I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob But I did not make myself known by my name. Yud He Vav He, Yehovah or Yahweh. Say to the Israelite people, I am Yehovah. I will free you from the burdens of the Egyptians. I will take you to be my people. I will be your God. Now here is a whole new beginning. A beginning with a promise from God to Moses and the Israelites, a people God is calling out to be his own, a personal God who wants to be known by his name. He detests Egypt. He loves his people. He says he's going to fight for them. This, right here, this is the start of Israel's history as a true nation. So Moshe visits Pharaoh again. He insists that the Israelites be freed. Pharaoh declines. Moshe warns Pharaoh. Pharaoh's not used to being warned. Pharaoh bristles with anger. He refuses to let the Israelites go. Pharaoh's refusal, although it can be well understood, when one considers that to allow the Israelites to leave would be tantamount to destroying the entire working class of Egypt. The Israelites represented not only the unskilled labor, but also the best craftsmen. I mean, imagine what would happen in the United States if all of our carpenters, plumbers, electricians, cement layers, steel workers, roofers, painters, laborers of every variety, those wonderful people that labor behind the counters of Wendy's and Burger King, well, they all suddenly disappeared. Imagine that. This is exactly what was being proposed to Pharaoh by Moses. What would you do if you were the leader of Egypt? So to attain the release of his people, something drastic was going to be needed. Yehovah responds by attacking the Egyptians through their gods. The Nile turns to blood. Frogs inundate the land. Boils inflict the people. Locusts attack their crops. Finally, God lets the Egyptian people and the Pharaoh feel the devastation that the Israelites felt at the time of Moses' birth. All the firstborn die. Interestingly, this deadly curse even applies to all Egyptian-owned livestock. Well, the plagues achieve their purpose. Pharaoh relents. He bids the Israelites goodbye and they leave. He changes his mind. He chases them to the edge of the Red Sea, trapped. The people feel certain Moses has made a fatal error. As their backs are against the deep waters, they have no place now to escape. God opens the sea for them. He even dries the sea bottom, and the Israelites escape to the distant shore. Pharaoh's troops chase them. They're drowned when the waters that God opened for the Israelites come crashing down upon all those soldiers. Now, the exact site of this crossing is unknown, as is the exact route that the Israelites took while leaving Egypt. Liberal scholars claim they didn't cross through the Red Sea at all. Rather, they went over a large mudflat called the Reed Sea. But this makes no sense, because even if it was unnecessary that God opened the waters for their escape, it's a lot more difficult to understand how all those Egyptian soldiers drowned in a few inches of water that covered that mudflat. Well, many Bible researchers think what they crossed over was indeed, at that time called the Red Sea, but is now called the Gulf of Suez. Now, there's been a lot of scholarly research on this pivotal biblical event, or better, I think, miracle of God. And as we well know, much faith has been required for Christendom to stand firm against the consensus of opinion among some of the most renowned archaeologists and Egyptologists who say the entire thing is an improbable myth. Actually, there is the greatest archaeological evidence that at a minimum, the Exodus did occur, And the number of Israelites was enormous. And as we previously discussed, that the city where they were purported to live was of sufficient size to support a large Hebrew population. Recently, however, some new light has been shed on the issue of the route of the Exodus as well as the location of Mount Sinai. I'd like to share some of that with you because I personally find the evidence quite convincing, or I wouldn't even offer it to you. But let me say up front that I'm certainly not dogmatic about it, and reasonable people can differ about things. Now, hopefully, we've well established where the Israelites were located in Egypt, and that was primarily in a place called Goshen, the land of Goshen. So knowing where they departed from, what would have been their most likely route? We know that God did not take them directly to Canaan through the most direct route, which would have been by a roadway called the Way of the Philistines. Instead, we are told that God led them on a route through the wilderness. Now, even though we know that they were eventually going to wind up in Canaan, what was their first destination? Their first stopping point? Sometime earlier, God had instructed Moses that when he brought the people out of Egypt, he was immediately to bring them to the mountain of God. Today, we often refer to the mountain of God as Mount Sinai. So where is the mountain of God? Let's backtrack for just a minute to find out. Moses was still in the court of the Pharaoh. But after he had killed that Egyptian and fled to avoid prosecution, we know he went to the land of Midian. The location of the land of Midian is very well established geographically through archaeology, all manner of ancient records. So this isn't even disputed. Midian is on the western end of what we today call the Arabian Peninsula. There in Midian, Moses encountered God on a hilltop. This was the burning bush incident. Well, Exodus 3:1 tells us about that event. It says this: Now Moses was pasturing the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a blazing fire from the midst of a bush. So, still in Midian, Moses had moved his flocks to the western side of the desert, the wilderness that he resided in. A little further down in Exodus 3 and verse 12, we come to this all-important statement. Remember now, we're still in the midst of the burning bush conversation with God, when the Bible tells us this: And he, God, said, Certainly I will be with you, Moses, and this shall be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you bring the people out of Egypt, you shall worship God at this mountain, the mountain of the burning bush. Bring them here, Moses. So the same mountain where God gave Moses his walking orders to go fetch the people of Israel out of Egypt is the same mountain that Moses was to bring the Israelites to encounter God upon their exit from Egypt. So Mount Sinai is not on the Sinai Peninsula. It's on the Arabian Peninsula. Now, could that be right? Well, none other than the Apostle Paul says so. Right? In Galatians 4:25, Paul says, Now this Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia. Now, don't get hung up on the Hagar term. Paul was just using Hagar, mother of Ishmael, to make an illustration. The information important to our current subject is the location of Mount Sinai. Where does Paul say Mount Sinai, also called Mount Horeb, is located? Arabia, which is where Midian is. Philo, the great Jewish philosopher, says Mount Sinai is in Arabia. Josephus, who lived during the time of Christ, says it was common knowledge then that Mount Sinai was on the Arabian Peninsula. So if the mountain where the people of the Exodus went to receive the law was in Arabia, why have all modern-day Christian travelers, me included, ventured to a monastery at the tip of the Sinai Peninsula that's identified as Mount Sinai, thinking this must be the place where Moses received the Ten Commandments. Why do all the history books of today show the route of the Exodus as going through that particular location? Well, prior to about 300 AD, there was absolutely nothing culturally, traditionally, or historically in Egypt, Palestine, or Arabia, or anywhere else for that matter, that connected the tip of the Sinai Peninsula as the location as the mountain of God, Mount Horeb, Mount Sinai. It wasn't until Christianity had fully emerged as a Gentile religion and any element of Jewishness was now taboo and rapidly being removed from biblical history, that the Sinai Peninsula was considered as being the place where the Ten Commandments, as well as the Torah, was received by Moses. Now, some ascetic monks in the 4th century AD were wandering through that area. They felt that a particular mountain on the tip of Sinai resembled some of the biblical descriptions of the mountain of God, and they decided, aha, this must be the place. They even named that particular mountain Mount Sinai. And from that and a vision of Constantine's, Emperor Constantine's mother, Catherine, the church concluded this is the place Moses spoke of. They built a church there, and that's that. Well, let's take a look at one more issue, the Red Sea crossing. Now, first of all, I want to say I'm not going to try to find a way using some rare but natural phenomenon as a way to explain the parting of the waters and the drying of the seabed. It was an act of God. It was a miracle impossible except by the Creator's own doing. Now, as is well known from times of antiquity, there existed a trade route that went across the center of the Sinai Peninsula. In fact, it's very likely this is the same route that Moses used to first flee to Midian as a young fugitive, then to return to gather the people of Israel from Pharaoh's land. Now, this known route leads to a long, winding riverbed that goes through a mountainous wilderness area. It dumps out at the Gulf of Aqaba, a large, deep finger of the Red Sea, which separates the main body of the Sinai from the Arabian Peninsula. Now, at the end of this gorge, called the PHARAOH, is a huge beach, fully capable of holding 2 to 3 million people. And directly across from it, directly across the other side of the Gulf of Aqaba from this beach, the opposite shore, lies another beach of more than sufficient size for the fleeing Israelites to have gathered as they watched the waters crush and drown the Pharaoh's army. Here's the thing. The Gulf of Aqaba is very deep, up to 1,000 feet in spots. What must be considered is that when God parted those waters and he dried the seafloor, the geography could not have been too steep of an incline from the beach to the seafloor, or too rocky or too uneven for a couple of million people with elderly and children and disabled and livestock to travel over. Now, between the two beaches I've identified to you, one on each side of the Gulf, is a raised portion of seabed lying only about 50 feet under the water. It is wide, it is sandy, and it's relatively flat. If the Gulf were drained of water at this location, we would find a perfect land bridge between the two sides of the Gulf connecting these two large beaches. Now, regardless of their route out of Egypt, the Israelites are now free. They're out of Egypt after a 400-year stay. Actually, it was 430 years to the day after Jacob, Israel, entered Egypt at the behest of his son Joseph that the Israelites escaped Pharaoh's clutches. Well, we're now at a point of about 1350 BC. Now, although we're studying the Israelites, let's not forget the rest of the world wasn't without activity. Far to the north, the Assyrians are a new and growing power, and they have empire building in mind. To the west, The Greeks are sailing as far as England and Ireland. In the Mediterranean, Crete, with its highly advanced civilization and art and science, surpassing even that of the Egyptian, just disappears for reasons scholars still debate to this day. Estimates of the size of the group that Moses led are from 3,000 to 3.5 million. The only numbers that the Bible gives us are that there were 600,000 men capable of bearing arms. Now, if one considers the arms-bearing age to have been from, say, roughly 17 to 40 years of age, it would be reasonable to multiply that number by 5 or 6 to account for women, children, elderly, and females. Now, many liberal scholars doubt the biblical reference to 600,000 males for no other reason than it would indicate a vast horde of people, tending to the largest number I've mentioned. But the reality is that all evidence points to that large number. The Egyptians were so afraid of the Israelites' enormous population that they took the drastic measure of killing the Hebrew firstborn males just to slow their growth. And this would only have hindered their aggressive building plans. They also know that for a long time after the Israelites left, building in Egypt crawled nearly to a halt, and their civilization just stalled. A few thousand Israelites in a land estimated to at that time to have been populated by 10 to 12 million Egyptians just simply couldn't have created either alarm by their presence or economic breakdown by their absence. However, if perhaps a quarter of the population of Egypt were Israelites, as suggested by the Bible, that is a different matter. And it might explain the severe economic downturn that occurred following their exodus. So I think a number in the 2 to 3 million range is entirely probable. Now, God led the Israelites with a cloud by day, a column of fire at night, and as we mentioned earlier, during the first 3 weeks, they traveled both day and night. After all, in the mind of Pharaoh, the Israelites were fugitives. They were escapees. They weren't refugees. So the Israelites were acutely aware of God's presence with them. And about a month into their journey, many realities of their changed living conditions began to settle in. Not the least of which, how is a wandering horde of 2 to 3 million hungry mouths going to eat? They were allowed to take their flocks and their herds with them, but grain, that's the staple food. Even if they had brought some grain with them, it would have only lasted a few days, weeks at best. Well, their route required them to stay away from known natural food and water sources. They were in a desert wilderness that even today is inhabited by no more than maybe 4,000 people. But even if they had followed these routes, it's unthinkable that there was any way they could have organized to provide for themselves these huge volumes of food and water that were required. Feeding 2 to 3 million people could only occur in a very structured, sophisticated city, like the advanced and magnificent Egyptian cities they'd come from. They were displaced city slickers, suddenly turned into wandering tent dwellers. Israel didn't have a clue how to survive in these conditions. Well, the U.S. Army quartermaster has calculated what it would take to provision 3 million people. On a daily basis, it would take a minimum of 11 million gallons of water. And for food, the capacity of all the freight cars of 2 trains, each of them a mile long. This is every day. This wouldn't even account for the food and water for their flocks and herds. God solved the problem very elegantly. He just rained food from the sky, as needed, in the form of manna. And manna was a tasty, nutritious food that would be their primary food supply for the next 40 years as they wandered in the Sinai. Pretty boring. But manna was apparently healthy. And as they needed water, God provided. He even sprang it forth from rocks in apparently enormous volumes. And by the way, upon entering the promised land, the delivery of the daily manna stopped as quickly as it started. Well, about 12 weeks after leaving Egypt, they arrived at the foot of Mount Sinai, also called Mount Horeb. The mountaintop that Moses would ascend was ringed in clouds, we're told. And God called to him. It must have been like deja vu, as Moses remembered back 40 years to when he first met God in the burning bush at this same place. And there God reiterated the promises he had made to Moses and to the Israelites during the wringing out of Pharaoh's will back in Egypt. But God went even further. He said, "If you will keep my covenant, then you will be my own treasure from among all peoples. You will be a kingdom of priests for me. You will be a nation set apart." Moses climbs back down the mountain. He assembles all the people. Now, certainly a couple of million people did not hear Moses' voice. But to those leaders and elders who did hear Moses announce what God had just told him, they replied, "All that the Lord has spoken, we will do." He climbs back up the mountain. He receives the 10 Commandments. Now, actually, he goes up and down the mountain a number of times, during which times a lot of doctrine and law is given to Moses by God. These laws and commandments are what today we call the Torah. We think of it as the first 5 books of the Christian Bible. Now, modern Bibles use the word law when translating the word Torah. This is a large misnomer that we'll explore later. On one trip back down the mountain, Moses returns to find that many of the disgruntled Israelites had built a golden calf to worship. 400 years in Egypt has polluted their worship. And many of their practices had become pagan and certainly an abomination to God. The golden calf, no doubt, was a representation of the Apis bull, which was a very high deity of the Egyptians, of which the people were fully aware and likely participated in worshiping during their centuries in Egypt. Moshe, infuriated, hurls these stone tablets of the 10 Commandments in a rage, and he follows God's orders that the still faithful kill as many of those calf worshippers as possible, and a bloodbath ensues, and the rebels are purged. Well, it was at Mount Sinai that the Levites were first anointed as God's priests, and Aaron is the first high priest. And among the instructions that God gave to Moses was that an earthly model of God's heavenly dwelling place should be constructed to very exacting standards. This wilderness tabernacle would be an elaborate, richly decorated tent that would travel with the Israelites. And around the tent, which consisted of 2 internal compartments, was a large courtyard where the priest would officiate as the Israelite worshipers brought their animal sacrifices to be slaughtered and then burned up on a brazen altar. And inside the tent were special ritual furnishings. The most famous of these was the Ark of the Covenant, with its special lid, the mercy seat. Now, the ark was placed at the back, at the rearmost compartment of the tent, compartment that would be called the Holy of Holies. It was there that Moses would meet with God when God called to him. Well, after about a year camped at the base of Mount Sinai, Moses leads the people to the oasis of Kadesh Barnea. Now, Kadesh was on the southern border of the land of Canaan, the land that they had been sent to claim. It was about a 150-mile journey of 11 days and over some very rough, dry, rocky, scorching terrain. And the people grumbled all along the way. And now, a little more than 15 months into their journey to the land God had promised them, tempers were getting short. These people didn't feel they could stand much more. Little did they know what actually lay ahead. So now Moses' sister, Miriam, one of his staunchest supporters, she wonders out loud if God and Moses have any clue what they're doing. She's struck with leprosy for her sin of contempt and disbelief. Upon arrival at Kadesh, Moshe immediately sends out spies to reconnoiter, knowing full well that the promised land, Canaan, is inhabited by people who are not going to be thrilled at the prospect of 3 million uninvited foreigners showing up on their doorstep. He wants to know what they're up against. So 12 spies are sent out, one of them from each tribe, and they return with conflicting stories. Of course. 10 of them say the land is everything God promised. But the inhabitants are big, strong, and well-armed. It'd be suicide to engage them in battle. Yahshua, a member of the tribe of Ephraim, and Caleb, from the tribe of Judah, now they have a different impression. They think the Israelites should just go ahead and attack immediately and stand on God's promise of victory. Not coincidentally, it would be the tribes of Ephraim and Judah that would one day become dominant over all the other tribes of Israel. And those would be the two tribes that Jacob would bless with the firstborn blessing to become the new leaders of Israel. Well, rumors spread around the encampment. People have no interest in battle. They're pooped. Their expectation was that the hardest part of their transition to their new home was just going to be a journey. They whine, they cry, they tear at their clothes in anguish, wondering why God would bring them all the way out here just to die. Then the unthinkable happens. Mutiny. They decide they're going to appoint a new leader and do away with Moses. Bad idea. God decides he's going to judge these rebels with poisonous snake bites, sickness, all manner of pestilence. Moshe pleads with God to forgive the people's rebellion, and God relents, but a price is going to be extracted for the people's actions. God declares that not one of the Israelites who are currently of an age of accountability will live to enter the promised land, except for Joshua and Caleb, who did their best to persuade their people to believe God. Now, sadly, for other reasons, this is also going to apply to Moses. Standing at the threshold of centuries of promise, the Israelites, they're turned away, back into the barren desert. Only 2 years removed from dwelling in mud brick houses in Egypt's great cities, 3 million Israelites now live as Bedouins, still live to this day, journeying from oasis to oasis, living in goatskin tents. Finally, at the appointed time, the Israelites again began their move towards Canaan, the promised land, but this time they did not hesitate to move forward and follow God. They circled around, they avoided the lands of Moab, who had been named after a son of Lot, and Edom. Edom's another name for Jacob's brother Esau. And they took on a less formidable foe in Heshbon, north of Moab. They fought, they won, they used the area as a staging ground for their attack of Canaan. 2 tribes and half of another tribe decided to go no further and to settle there on the east side of the Jordan River, outside of the Promised Land. Well, it's about 1300 BC, and the Israelites are standing on the east bank of the Jordan River. They're finally ready to take possession of Canaan. Moses dies, and they mourn him for 30 days. Moshe, the greatest prophet, is the only prophet to know God face to face. The Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, make it clear he had audible conversation with God throughout his ministry. Can you imagine? Joshua is then appointed the new leader. And beginning next week, we will open the book of Joshua at chapter 1 and follow him as he leads God's people to their new home.